What does turning the other cheek really mean? But let's read the passage in Luke where this comes from. Now, Matthew also records something similar. He says, "But I say to you who are listening, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. To whoever strikes you on the cheek, offer the other cheek also. And from him who takes away your outer garment, do not withhold your tunic also." So the first thing to note is that this isn't about if you're in immediate danger or someone you love is in immediate danger. Can you defend yourself? Is self-defense okay? That's not what he's addressing here. That's just simply not the context. He's addressing people who are being rude or mean or evil or insulting to you. What do you do in those circumstances? So in Luke here, he sets up this whole dialogue with love your enemies. That's his main point. And then he talks about turning the other cheek. In Matthew, it's a little more complicated. He splits it apart and has turning the other cheek up with the idea of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, if someone slaps you on the cheek, turn the other one also. That's what he says in Matthew. And then he goes on to talk about loving your enemies. But in Luke, he kind of merges the two ideas together, where loving your enemies and turning the other cheek are kind of all tied together. So the two examples he gives in Luke of how to love your enemies is to turn the other cheek and to let them have your tunic as well if they take your outer garment. So why would Christ say something like turn the other cheek? What does that mean? Well, in the culture of the Bible, to strike someone on the cheek is an insult. So we see that in Lamentations 3:30. It says, "Let him give his cheek to the one who strikes him. Let him be filled with shame." So striking someone on the cheek fills someone with shame. In 1 Kings 22:24, we see an interesting story, an example of slapping or striking someone on the cheek. It says, "Then Zedekiah, the son of Chenaanah, came near and struck Micaiah on the cheek." This is not an attack on Micaiah's life or anything like that. It was just that Zedekiah was insulted by Micaiah's true prophecy. So he was like, this guy's basically upstaging me. So he runs up and slaps him. That is an insult. So we see that in the biblical culture. Slapping someone on the cheek is to insult them. We also see that in even our modern culture. So if you remember the case where Will Smith felt really insulted by one of Chris Rock's jokes, he ran up on the stage and slapped him almost as hard as he could. It was one of the most awkward moments in TV history. But what happened? Will Smith felt insulted, so he wanted to insult Chris Rock back. He didn't just start a fight and start punching him. He slapped him. He slapped him on the cheek. It was a major, major insult. So he felt insulted, and so he wanted to insult Chris Rock back. So we see that to strike one on the cheek is to insult them. So we see that in all of these examples in Matthew and Luke that he gives, turning the other cheek, letting them have the outer garment or your tunic, carrying something with them 2 miles when they ask you to go 1 mile. All of these things are not about physical imminent danger. They're about evil people taking advantage of you or insulting you. And Jesus responds with things like turning the other cheek or going 2 miles instead of just 1 mile with them. So all of these examples are not about immediate imminent danger. So what is Jesus saying by turning the other cheek? It means to be merciful instead of taking revenge, right? So he's contrasting it, at least in the Matthew example, he's contrasting it with an eye for an eye. So instead of an eye for an eye, you're supposed to turn the other cheek. You're supposed to be merciful. It means to not do something to someone that they deserve. So if someone deserves an eye for an eye, to be merciful is to not do that. It's to not take revenge. So that's what Jesus is saying. Instead of enacting justice on your own, be merciful. Turn the other cheek. When someone insults you, don't insult them back. Don't slap them on their cheek, but turn your other cheek. Be merciful to them. We see this at the end of the passage in Luke 6:36. He says, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. So that's how he sums up the passage. So when he's saying, turn the other cheek and give them your tunic instead of just your outer garment, these are all examples of showing mercy. So that's how we're to understand what it means to turn the other cheek. So all of these points illustrate mercy. We are supposed to love our enemies and show mercy to them. Why? Because God has been merciful to us. And I think if you look at his different points, we're supposed to be different from the world. As Paul says, we're supposed to be holy and set apart from the world. So the world takes revenge. The world gives and expects something in return. In this context, Jesus is saying, yeah, the world does all those things, but I want you to be different. So I think there's also some sort of evangelistic aspect to this. So turning the other cheek, being merciful to someone when they don't deserve it, is actually really convincing for people. That's actually how I became a Christian. I saw somebody love me in a way that wasn't beneficial to them at all. So if we show mercy to people who don't deserve it, I think it will actually be really convicting to people and to the world. Now, God's desire is not for evil to just run rampant. That's not what he's meaning here in Luke 6 and in Matthew 5. It's just simply not our role to avenge ourselves. As Paul says in Romans 12:19, we're supposed to leave justice to the governing authorities. We see that in Romans 13:4. So, as I mentioned earlier, Jesus is not talking about self-defense here. There's actually very, very few places in the whole Bible that really address self-defense. But I think practically, self-defense just makes sense in a lot of circumstances, and biblically, I think we can make a strong case for self-defense. So we see that in Acts 22:25, Paul tells the centurion who's about to flog him, he says, I'm a Roman citizen. And since he was a Roman citizen, the centurion was not supposed to be flogging him. But what is he doing there? He's stopping a punishment from happening. So he's doing self-defense. He's practicing self-defense. If Paul didn't believe in self-defense, then he would have let the centurion flog him. It wasn't his place to stop any injustice from happening. No, we see that there are certain occasions where self-defense is appropriate. So overall, turning the other cheek does not mean to let people abuse you. That's not what turning the other cheek means. Rather, it means to show mercy to someone who is insulting you. So to slap someone on the cheek is to insult them. So why would we do this? Why would we act in this way? So that we could be a light to the world. And hopefully the world would see that we are different and they would want to follow Christ.